Okay, we want to get started and respect everybody's time today. Thank you guys. Thank everyone for coming today on a Friday. I know a lot of you may have used this as an excuse to get out of your normal workday, but thanks for actually showing up. We have a sold-out event today. We think this is a very important panel, taking a look at the ISIS strategy. And a lot of us have had conversations on both sides of the issue, and a lot of us believe that the strategy may not necessarily be working. And what we hope to do today is actually be able to present some of the issues, some of the obstacles, and also some of the solutions. We are going to make this a 45-minute session with us, and then open it up for 45 minutes for questions, since a lot of you came today, and make sure that we get your input so we can make this a good Friday panel today. I have the honor of being able to moderate a panel of distinguished people that have spent a lot of time in Iraq as Americans, and of course, spent a lot of time in Iraq trying to make it a better country. To my immediate left, we have Ambassador Feisal al-Istrabadi, and the ambassador was the Iraqi ambassador to the UN and is now the founding director of the Center for the Study of the Middle East at Indiana University. He's also a senior advisor to the Iraq Task Force, which is being sponsored by the Atlantic Council and headed by former Ambassador Ryan Crocker. To his immediate left, Dr. Denise Natali, who's also a member of this advisory group. So we have some good people on this advisory group, the Iraq Task Force. And Denise has spent considerable time in the Middle East, in Iraq, in Syria, and Turkey, working post-conflict issues, and is an expert at the National Defense University on Kurdistan and these issues, and it's great to have her here today. Thank you so much for coming. And a gentleman that gave me a lot of access in 2007, retired Colonel Welch, retired Special Forces officer, who spent a 2-year stint in Iraq, did such a good job that he was asked to come back, and his next stint was for 5 years. He directly engaged with the leaders of the Awakening and the Sons of Iraq. He was instrumental in forging relationships with the Baghdad belts, which are crucial to the security of Baghdad, and a lot of the areas where you see ISIS now. Rick has maintained, Colonel Welch, sorry about that, has maintained these relationships to this day. And the people that he's worked with were not only targeted by al-Qaeda and militias during the surge, as well as the Iraqi government, as the Iraqi government looked to dismantle the security apparatus, but then they were targeted again by ISIS. And they're also left to reprisal attacks again by militias. So the point of this panel is to really talk about what needs to be done with Sunni engagement in the Sunni population centers in Iraq. And if it's not done right, we're simply resetting the conditions that led to ISIS to begin with if we don't do this right. And with that, I'll go ahead and go to opening comments by Ambassador.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to be here. And thank you to Mr. Pregent for organizing the panel. I think it's timely. Iraq may be the most sort of important regional national security issue from the American perspective that seems to me to be fairly routinely ignored in the media these days and even by policymakers. So I'm delighted that we have this opportunity to engage on some of the issues. Well, the title of the panel involves a subtitle, I guess, an unfocused Baghdad and a disinterested White House. I don't disagree with that characterization, quite contrary. But it could also be recharacterized, I think, as Baghdad being exclusively focused on and the White House interested exclusively in the narrow issues of how to occupy the next square meter from ISIL, how to take away the next square meter from ISIL-held territory. I don't think Baghdad is focused at all, and I don't think the White House is considering at all how to secure the peace after ISIL is defeated. This is not this is not a question of of setting priorities. Let us defeat ISIL, then we can sit down around a table and determine what the post-ISIL phase looks like. Because I think we've reached a point in Iraqi politics that people need to know what they're fighting for. We know what we're fighting against. And I think one of the things we can say about Iraq, in distinction to Syria, although I'm no Syria expert, is that at least in Iraq, generally, the political parties generally are united in the fight against ISIL. But what are we fighting for is, I think, a question that most, are we fighting to preserve democracy? Is this the war to end all wars, etc.? I take as a premise Ambassador Crocker's, it's actually provable. I don't take it as a mere given. It's provable, but I don't have time to prove it in the few minutes I have now. But underlying my statements is Ryan Crocker's statement that the U.S. is hardwired into the Iraqi political system. And there's much truth to that. I also take it as a given, which I think I could also prove if I had the time, that the U.S. has been failing, of late at least, if not longer, in a truly meaningful engagement. I will give a concrete example. The U.S. Special Envoy, Presidential Envoy for Iraq and Syria, or for the anti-ISIL coalition, has, for instance, made a routine habit of meeting only with those Iraqis who agree with existing American policy. Now, this leaves out groups in Parliament. It strikes me as an unwise policy. I can give a concrete example that the last time that Mr. McGurk met with the bloc that is headed by Ayad Allawi, the former prime minister, was in 2014, before the selection of Haidar al-Abadi as prime minister. Now, this strikes me as not meaningfully engaged with a fairly important group, which has numbers of representatives in Parliament, not to mention the sort of singular nationalist bloc, liberal secular bloc, which should, in the normal course of things, one would think, be a natural ally of the United States. From the Iraqi perspective, there are two overarching problems. And I'm sorry, I didn't keep track of when I started, so you're going to have to cut me off here.
I will. I've worked on my transition line.
Thank you. There are two overarching problems very quickly. They inhere in everything I have to say. One is, over the years, a loss of a common identity amongst the Iraqis. This is a huge problem that is going to take years to overcome. But that, nonetheless, the discussions about that, I think, need to be begun. That's a slight oversimplification, but again, I don't have time for subtlety right now. Inherent in that is a lack of trust, a breakdown in trust across groups. Now, the problems, I think, also inhere in the solutions that I will propose, and I have, I think, three. Both Baghdad and Washington have failed to focus on institution building in Iraq. The question is always who should occupy this or that position, not what is the structure that should be created. I have had the opportunity of sparring on more than one occasion with Mr. McGurk, who, for instance, would ask, when I was advocating that it was time that Mr. Maliki was past his sell-by date, if not Maliki, who, rather than what. I think U.S. policy has, for a long time, predating Mr. McGurk, suffered from this disease of whoism. There's always an indispensable figure. Well, of course, none of us is indispensable. We're all fungible, and we will all funge one day. Along these lines, I think it's important also to begin creating national institutions, in particular a national defense force.
This is very good, but when you talk about what are the political aspects of this, what I often get is, yes, 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 let's talk about that later. We have to focus on the military first, then we focus on the politics. And what we're missing is this is largely political. And if we miss the political part, we're going to get the whole bit wrong. So part of this we know, that in 2014, by the way, is very different than where we are today. We started with, yes, Sunni Arab grievances. This started in 2003 in the nature of the abrupt disruption of the Iraqi state. It continued with different leaders, and we know about the story between Maliki and how this aggravated. But what I'd like to focus on now is how have those grievances been exacerbated by the anti-ISIL campaign, and that's us, okay? So we can continue to blame the Iraqi government, and there are issues there, but my question is, what are we doing to make things worse? And I got lots of them. So one, this anti-Daesh campaign, as I said, is being perceived as military first. The ambassador said it very nicely, taking inches of territory, which is important. But let's look at what does that mean. 40 to 45% of the territory that has been taken from Daesh has largely been to the advantage of certain groups. The Kurdish Peshmerga have been extremely effective. We're working by, with, and through local partners on the ground. However, that also translates into very political issues because those territories are also perceived to be the territories of Sunni Arab communities, other minorities communities, and they were part of disputed territories. Kurdish territories as well. My point is, it's now become even more politicized when you start now taking border through blood. And the Daesh campaign is part of this. That's number one, that I don't really think we're getting a grasp of how important that is on the ground. Nobody really prioritizes defeating Daesh. I mean, they do, but there's also a lot to be gained. When your strategy is by, with, and through, that means your local partners will also use this aid to take more territories, engage in demographic engineering, do whatever it is, get more hydrocarbons resources, whatever it is you need to do. All of these small local groups have got a lot to gain from this. And until we can realize this, then we're going to get it wrong. Why would a Kurdish group have any interest in building a strong Sunni Arab force? It makes no sense. Why would the Kurds have any interest in going into Mosul city? It's not of their interest, and they won't do it. And we need to understand this, and understand, as this terrific Wall Street Journal article came out yesterday, if you don't do it with the Sunni Arab communities in these Daesh strongholds, we will get nowhere. So that's another one. Now, another big point that was made to me, and by the way, nearly every Iraqi has said this to me, and particularly the last trip, are you ready for the second iteration of Daesh? Because there will be a second iteration of Daesh, okay? In the sense that when we talk about now of liberated territories, we're in a different spot now than 2 years ago. There actually are the territories that, the safe havens that have been liberated are now liberated. And as Mike asked me last night, are they really liberated? So you have 3 million Sunni Arab IDPs and other communities as well that now need to go back to these territories. They're in no man's land. Most of them can't go back. Tikrit is, I say, a relative success story, a success. At most of the IDPs are back. But you've got these areas now that are complete wastelands, entire wastelands. So what do you do about communities, Sunni Arab communities largely, who not only were disaffected, but absolutely see no future in this country? Okay, and I really hesitate about using these phrases, Sunni, Shia. I don't like this. Let's just say IDPs, and the Iraqi government has got big troubles with this drop in oil prices and struggling to make reforms. So the UN is doing its best, but this is one of the issues we should be thinking about. If you want to defeat Daesh, you've got to make the communities believe that they're part of this country. As Iraqis, by the way, and I fully agree, this bit about sectarian and ethnic quotas is doing no good, and I'm not surprised why many Iraqis say, why do the Americans want to split up the country? Because you don't really get that when you're on the ground, and we should be very wary of this. And that gets into the point about now liberating Daesh strongholds. We mentioned this again, and let's look at Mosul. if you go about this and think that every group wants to defeat Daesh as an Iraqi, then we're getting it wrong. Mosul will require a political settlement beforehand. Everybody's making deals right now. Who's going to get East Mosul? Who's going to get Nineveh? Who's going to be in charge? What happens to former Governor Najafi? I mean, this is all behind-the-scenes deal-making. And it will not be liberated, it cannot be liberated, as we said, without majority local populations. So who are the key populations in Mosul? They need to control it. Who is going to hold and stabilize these areas? That plan needs to be made before we go into these areas. Who will hold and who will stabilize? And I don't think that that is really, again, being thought through. So where there was alliances before, there were good tactical alliances between some Sunni Arab tribal leaders and the Kurds, some groups here, and it's going on in Syria too. Some of these are actually now breaking down because of the very, very drastic change in the balance of power in the north about who are the winners and who are the losers. Okay, so we need to be careful about what Daesh has been superimposed over. And these pre-existing conflicts that were political are still there. I want to be very brief. So it's about who is going to get what. That's the game plan. What can we do? I would start this out as what we should know, what we can't do. Okay, and what should we expect ourselves realistically? We're not going to fix this. We're not going to fix Iraq in the next 5 years. That is to say, go in and let's let's expect a quick democracy promotion fix. But I think we should try not to make things worse. That would be to start with, and try not to make things worse. Think through the second and third order consequences of what this campaign is leading to, and why we're now having these very significant disputes in some of these Daesh-free territories. There are 9 lines of effort. There are 9 lines of effort in our campaign strategy. A large focus, of course, has been expelling Daesh safe havens, and the other has been anti-ISIL messaging. We haven't focused, in my view, enough on the humanitarian line of effort. We haven't focused enough on the governance line of effort. We're now at the stage where these areas, as the ambassador indicated, are liberated, but who is going to engage in the local power sharing? I mean, these are, particularly in the north, much of this is disputed areas, and much of this are mixed territories. You've got Christian communities, Yazidi communities, and this is not just between Kurd, Arab, Sunni, Shia, by the way. This is very, very localized. It's very localized. We should not think there's going to be a Sunni, Shia, Kurd region. It's just not helpful, and it's not realistic, and I don't know of any Sunni groups who want to leave Iraq. They're Iraqi nationalists. And we need to get that straight, but think through, what do we do with the territories that we've so-called liberated? So that's part of it. Working through whether that's the United Nations is taking it, but the Iraqi government's in a difficult position right now. How do we assist in stabilizing and helping the IDPs return back to their areas? I think the optics, and again, in the messaging is really important from the U.S. side, because we do matter. I don't think we're using our leverage the extent that we can, because we still do have leverage. Not as much, but certainly over local groups. What's our strategic end state? Do we want Iraq to stay together, or do we want to keep giving the perception there's going to be a division in 3? Okay, there are Iraqi nationalists, okay, and I would emphasize, as the ambassador indicated, institutions of Iraq. If you're going to fuel or support certain local groups, that should be based on conditionalities. We just give weapons to anybody and give money to anybody and say, that's okay, knock yourself out. So I don't think we're being clear enough, and we should be more clear of our strategic end state, which is an Iraqi state that remains intact with different forms of political power sharing, as we discussed. I'll leave that at that, and I'll be happy to take
We'll have to get back to whether the White House is interested in anything that you just said.
Sorry, I know,
But I'd like to go to Colonel Welch now, and basically based on what you've heard, how would you characterize the Sunni voice in all of this based on your contacts?
Well, first of all, thank you for, I'm not sure why I'm on this panel with these distinguished two here, but I appreciate being here, and the ambassador happens to be one of my longtime mentors, so it's an honor for me to be here. I have 4 points that I jotted down based on what folks are telling me now and what they told me in the years that I was there. And some of it, of course, overlaps. But one of the things that is foremost in their mind that they continue to ask is, what is the U.S. policy in and for Iraq besides now tackling ISIS? What does the U.S. really want in Iraq and want for Iraq? And as you know, there are all kinds of conspiracy theories that are generated because maybe we haven't been clear about that message. But one thing that I know didn't work in meeting after meeting, especially beginning late part of 2010 as the military was preparing to withdraw, we were transitioning our work to the embassy. A talking point began to permeate the message. So when the Iraqis that I was coordinating meetings with at the Reconciliation Center in Baghdad were meeting with our senior diplomats, our senior military leaders, they were, and this is not just Sunni, this was a cross-section, they were seeing what then Prime Minister Nouri Maliki was doing, trying to centralize, consolidate his power. They saw him as sort of rising as a dictator, trying to take control. And they would lay out these concerns to our folks that they were meeting with. And the talking point began, was like this. It says, well, we're very sorry to hear that, but Iraq is a sovereign country and we cannot interfere. And there was this sort of pregnant pause, you would see among these sophisticated Iraqis that our folks were meeting with. And then one of them would say, well, we're not sure we understand that because wasn't Libya a sovereign country, and didn't we see what you did to Muammar Gaddafi? And didn't the president say Mubarak needs to go in Egypt? Wasn't that a sovereign country? And aren't you putting sanctions against Syria? Wasn't that a sovereign country? And oh, by the way, aren't you still here? You invaded our country and you're still here? So what we see is not that you can't interfere. We see you interfering all around us to remove long-standing dictators. We see that you won't interfere here or intervene to prevent the rise of a dictator, a new dictator in Iraq, and one who's designed to take away the democracy that you said you're bringing. So that makes us wonder then why? What is it that you really want for Iraq? And so that talking point doesn't work, and it should be removed from the talking point pages, but it didn't work. And it certainly confused about the message about what does the U.S. want for Iraq. The second point is that relationships matter. I mean, I learned this very early on. Relationships matter, and there were 3 levels that an old tribal leader told me. He said there's the friend, the person that you grew up with and you're friends for life. There's the friend of my friend, that you build a relationship based on a friendship that exists between two other folks already, and that's sort of the second strongest relationship. And then there's the enemy of my enemy, the alliance you form to drive out a common enemy or address a common threat. And all of those relationships matter, and it matters that we build, we create, we strengthen, and we maintain those relationships. That has not happened in my experience in Iraq. I had a unique position of being there sort of, a long time. And other units we would rotate in, rotate out, just like the embassy, 1 year in, 1 year out. But there was no continuity of these relationships. We had to rebuild them all over again when the new folks came. And this created a problem. And I think Dr. Natali mentioned this. The relationships we built that led to the tribal awakening and the effectiveness, let's just take Baghdad, of taking back Baghdad from al-Qaeda and that had in 2007 was, when we began that program, we had 0 fighters, basically. Michael, I think, remembers this. And by the end of December, we had 60,000 just in Baghdad alone. 100,000 all over the country, but 60,000 in Baghdad. So based on relationships built up and down our chain of command, both diplomatically and politically, we could penetrate and saturate all the areas where security was needed. And those were the folks that held them and secured them after the threat was removed. And those folks who lived in those areas knew where whole cells of al-Qaeda were living. So we could uproot the cells, we could do precision operations instead of this indiscriminate shelling and bombing that as I say, indiscriminate bombing and shelling kills indiscriminately. You know, you can do precision operations if you build these relationships, and that's what led to the successes that we had. That's what I think is needed now. As I understand the engagement strategy, it's pretty much funneled through one or two people, and that will never work. It's not fast enough, it's not robust enough to get down to where people live. The third point is, I said, I don't think we've ever really seen what is going on in Iraq. We look at it through American eyes instead of Iraqi eyes and regional player eyes to see what's really going on. And I had an Iraqi general tell me just before I left Iraq, and he's still a ground force commander there today. He said Iran, basically, he heard other senior military and political leaders talking. This is Iran's plan for Iraq. The first one is eliminate all Baathists. Eliminate all Baathists, eliminate anyone who supported the government, whether they were just loyal to the government, whether they're Sunni or not, who supported the Iran-Iraq war. Eliminate all of them. Disrupt and displace the Sunni population to give the Shia areas a little more margin of influence. And we saw that play out and still see that playing out through the de-Baathification process, through indiscriminate targeting, arrest, and assassination of Sunnis. We see that. The second point was to then, after you get rid of all of them, then you eliminate and purge or marginalize anyone that was close to the United States during our time in Iraq. You marginalize them, you isolate the Iraqi people from the Americans, which I believe is going on now. And this general said that beautiful, nice embassy that you have will be a 5-star prison for the Americans who are in Iraq, because they won't be able to get out to engage the population. The population won't be able to get into the international zone to engage with them, and you'll be isolated from the Iraqi people. And you'll only be connected to those people that perhaps we agree with, or that have other interests going on in Iraq. And then the final thing is, the last thing Iran will do, it'll make sure the Shia groups who are left over never really have a strong alliance. They'll keep them fighting among one another, so Iran can always exert the influence it needs over any one particular group. We've seen this play out as well. And the final point is, it's what is the U.S. legacy in Iraq? I was at a meeting that I set up for one of our ambassadors. I won't say when or what time, it's not necessary. With national tribal leaders, the leaders of the major tribes or confederations, and these are pretty sophisticated folks. And they were saying, Ambassador, when the Ottomans were here, the Turks left this in Iraq, and when the British were here, they left this, and they described a lot of things. And they said, when America leaves, what is it that you will have left us? And the ambassador, with sort of a smile and a quip, said, well, democracy. And there was, again, a pregnant pause, and this one tribal leader, a Shia leader from the south, said, well, we believe that a government should bring 4 things for its people. One is security, the other one is fairness, rule of law, basically, fairness and justice in a system. The third is food, and the fourth is basic services. And, we look out in Iraq, and we have none of that now. It's worse now than it was before. We have none of that. So if this is democracy, with all due respect, Ambassador, when you all leave Iraq, please take it with you, because it's not working here. So we sort of made democracy look bad. And so what can we do? I agree with what the 2 real experts here have said. But I'll look at it in military terms. The main effort should be this full-court diplomatic press. That void is being filled right now by Iran. Iran has much more influence, over what's going on than, frankly, I think we do. And so we need what I would call a full-court press. Total engagement. The political effort must be the main effort to help Prime Minister Abadi, to help build the institutions that the ambassador mentioned that have not been built. And the main supporting effort, the first one should be defeating ISIS. And we can do that if we get the Sunni population, again, to trust us, and we get a relationship with them, rather than seeing us as supporting the sectarian cleansing, frankly, that's going on the ground today. And the second main supporting effort then should be genuine DDR program to disarm, demobilize, and reintegrate all militias, no matter who they are, to incorporate them in. And then one last point, and I know Mike's ready to cut me off here. Another thing that a tribal leader mentioned to one of our ambassadors, who said, "We use diplomacy now. The Americans, we use diplomacy." He said, "Well, Ambassador, what we've seen of American diplomacy, it's too slow, it's too naive, and it's too weak to push it back against Iranian, for instance, direct action in Iraq." And so the last point is we need to think about how to re-examine what our policy is, how we're going to use our diplomacy, and again, to develop a reconciliation program where when you use the word, masalaha with the Iraqi people, they don't laugh, they don't smile, they take it as something serious. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. And that brought up a consistent thread based on all the comments. U.S. needs to do more, and I'd ask this to each panelist, what leverage does the U.S. have, and is it willing to use that leverage? And at the same time, what interest does Baghdad have in actually allowing that leverage to be applied? Or you could ignore that question, whatever you want to say.
I was in this city at the Atlantic Council with, I'll also not mention a name because we're off the record, with a former senior diplomat in Baghdad, former senior American diplomat in Baghdad, who took the position in 2014 that the United States had no leverage with Iraq. My response is there's not a country in the world with whom the United States has no leverage. There are countries it has less leverage with than others, but there's leverage to be had. There is a moment, it's a complicated question to answer because it isn't entirely clear what the political class in Iraq actually wants. What's the fight for right now? We have Iraqis fighting in Fallujah now to retake Fallujah from ISIL. Are the Iraqis fighting to reunify Iraq? I believe some of them are. Perhaps the Iraqi forces, Iraqi as such forces are. Or are they fighting simply to protect Baghdad and the south of Iraq from suicide bombings? Those are two very different states of nature. And the answer is probably that some are fighting for one and others are fighting for the other. One can easily imagine that those militias closest to Iran are probably not fighting for the unity of the country. So I think the United States has certainly sufficient leverage to promote its own interests, which I think lie in the unity of Iraq, to promote those, again, state institutions. It has tremendous leverage there. And the fact that the Iraqis themselves look to the United States for support. They don't often get it, but they look for it. Tells you that the Iraqi political class, at least itself, looks to the United States as a leader, and that they are capable of having, to use your word again, leverage exercised upon them. And I think most Iraqi, rank and file Iraqis, do want the unity of the country, at least the Arabs of Iraq. And I think that's something the United States can play off of, and it's in its own interests, rather than having the chaos and turning Iraq into another Somalia. Because if Iraq falls apart, we will not, as Dr. Natali said, Professor Natali said, we will not fall apart into three regions. We will become a Somalia with oil. That's not just true in the Arab part of Iraq, by the way. Anyway, I've gone on too long.
I want to add, On my last trip, and this came from several Kurdish officials in the north, when we talk about leverage, I actually do think we have leverage, particularly with local groups. Okay, again, we can't fix everything in Iraq, but each one of these small entities, and we'll say it again, it's not Sunni, Shia, Kurd, it's locality, it's who's in charge of this locality. They're all seeking some form of recognition, and getting it from the United States and getting support from the United States does mean something, and I think we're underestimating that. When we give weapons and we give money and there's no conditionalities, okay, we are not using our leverage. What was told to me, I was so impressed by several Kurdish officials said, please do not give us aid without conditionalities. They asked us, do not do this. You are not helping us. We want to go back to institutions. If you want to give us assistance, if you want to give us weapons or money, then tie that with institution building. This will instead aggravate divisions, okay? That's one part of it. Secondly, optics matter. When you're giving aid and assistance in such an imbalanced way, and I'm sorry I have to be blunt, but the perception on the ground is that we are the Air Force for the Kurds to take territory. I'm not saying I'm taking a side, but this is the perception, okay? Fix it.
And for the Shia militias as well.
Yeah, fix it. So, but we're not support. The point is, we're directly supporting. So we just gave the Kurdish Peshmerga, because they are fighting for us, $415 million. Was there any conditionalities to that? I mean, so the point is, if we want to see Iraq as a whole, the idea of even giving the perception of favoring certain groups over others is not helpful. We do have leverage. And by the way, if we do care about the Kurds too, or any other group, then enhancing divisions doesn't help. So put conditionalities and use some of our leverage to affect behavior. If you want our assistance, and then when you do something wrong with our aid, like kick out Sunni Arabs from territories, well, then we need to also make clear statements about that this is unacceptable and we'll withdraw our aid. I mean, you've got to have some ultimatums.
Right. Excellent points. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, well, again, what worked when we did this the last time? It worked that we were the broker between all the different groups. In other words, we kept the Iraqi security forces and the militias from destroying the Sahwa, the tribal awakening folks, while they secured their area. And afterwards, because, the Iraqi security forces, by the fact that the Sons of Iraq got all that credit, it sort of shamed the Iraqi commanders, the Iraqi security forces and the government. So that was a dynamic that we had to deal with, and we were the glue and the bridge that brought them together. So, but again, we went from being a participator to a spectator, just sitting back watching things happen. So we need to get involved with all of those groups again in a row. They all need to have some representation, and we need to be the bridge that, that prevents indiscriminate targeting, that clears targeting, so that the real enemy gets dealt with, and then we can be the glue to try to help let them build this.
We have a leverage issue.
Right.
Ambassador, you want to say something?
I do. There's this notion the U.S. doesn't have leverage. The U.S. uses leverage when it wants to. When it doesn't want to, it says we have no leverage. And I can give you two live examples of this, and there are two examples of where the U.S. needs to stop meddling in the micromanagement of political and constitutional processes. The U.S., it isn't merely that the U.S. is not engaged in developing institutions in Iraq, it's that U.S. policy over the years has actively prevented the development of constitutional and legal institutions. I'll give you two examples. And, forgive me, one is from a few years ago, from 2012, which was when a constitutional challenge to Nouri al-Maliki arose in Parliament. And there was a sufficient alignment of parties in Parliament to cause a vote of no confidence in Nouri al-Maliki, which, by the way, would have been the first time in Iraqi history from the Constitution of 1925 to 2012, as of that date, still hasn't happened, that an Iraqi government would have been brought down through a constitutional parliamentary vote of no confidence. My God, that would have been an American success story. America put the full weight of its diplomacy, including diplomacy in Arab capitals and Ankara, to ensure that wouldn't happen, which turned out to be the last clear chance to avoid ISIL taking over Iraq's second largest city in 4 hours. More recently, exactly the same thing was done on a smaller scale as the Kurds were trying to figure out what to do with the presidency of the Kurdistan Regional Government when the legal term of office of the current incumbent came to an end. And Parliament, the KRG Parliament, was trying to figure out how to handle that. Again, America put it. So we're using leverage to prevent the establishment of constitutional and legal institutions. And honestly, for the United States of America, that's just a shame.
Oh, well said. Well said. Oh, at this time, we would like to actually open it up to questions. There's a lot of you here. I'd ask that you identify yourself, wait for the microphone to get to you, and then identify which panelist you want to answer the question. Sir, we'll start with you.
My name is Bob Kelly, and I represent the National Mobilization Force of Athil al-Najafi. So my question is to Dr. Natali. Today in the Wall Street Journal, you noticed al-Najafi is quoted,
Right.
and he said that the U.S. backs Baghdad, and the coalition backs the Kurds, but nobody backs the Sunnis. And my question is, who in the United States government backs the Sunnis? My suspicion is that the Pentagon does, because the Pentagon, or CENTCOM, trained 200 of al-Najafi's nationalization force in March and April in urban combat training. So
who else?
who else?
Sure.
Is that a sign of general support or one-off? Or
Yeah.
what do you think?
I'll get my thoughts first. That statement, U.S. backs Baghdad, coalition backs the Kurds. I mean, the U.S. is leading the coalition, and I wouldn't make such crude divisions between the coalition backing just the Kurds. The U.S. backs the Iraqi state and the Iraqi government, okay, of which the Kurds are a part. I don't think there's been, the perceptions are clear that there has been direct reliance on the Kurds as local partners on the ground by, with, and through the Iraqi government. And I think that's been made clear, but it should be made clearer. Whether or not, now when you say Sunnis, I have a problem with this in the sense that many of the, and again, I'm not Iraqi, so, talking about Sunnis and Sunni Arabs, well, there's lots of different groups. And this is why I said this idea of a Sunni region, there wasn't one group, except for yours, that wants a distinct Sunni Arab region and using that word, okay? So backing Sunnis, I don't really know what that means. Are you talking about a specific leader? Because there's been various efforts, some in the Gulf, some going on in Ankara, some going on in Nineveh, about who is going to lead the Sunnis. And so that's a problem within that community itself, and you know that, right? So to say the United States is not backing the Sunnis, I'll say to you, when they say about the Kurds, which ones? Right? So I think, in my view, the piece of this is which part of this community is working and part of the Iraqi forces, whether that be Sunni Arab tribal fighters working with the Iraqi government, then that support will be there. I think Mr. Najafi has his own problems, though, quite frankly, between getting support among the other Sunni Arab communities as well.
I think Rick would like to say something based on his experience working with the tribes in the past.
Yeah, I mean, the Pentagon wouldn't be doing any of that training without authorization from the White House. So, it is part of the train and support effort. But one of the main problems, I heard Dr. Rafi Asawi here, maybe within the last year or so, and Mr. Najafi, the issue was equipping the Sunnis out in these areas to be able to take on ISIS in their areas. And the central government did not want the United States dealing directly, arming and equipping the Sunni forces. But the problem is the equipment that they need doesn't get to them if you give it to the central government. This was one of the debates that was going on. And for instance, in Fallujah, we had a lot of folks from the Jamali tribe were participating in the effort to clear Karma. But when the the militias started, their activity, they stopped fighting because there is this issue, the sectarian issue. Same way with Fallujah, a lot of the Salafi tribal fighters are there. They're not getting the equipment they need to deal with ISIS. They're just getting enough equipment to, to engage in the fight, but the better equipped security forces and militias, they have the better equipment. This was a point of friction, I think. A lot of what is going on is, getting the equipment and being able to really get in the fight.
And I want to add another problem, and beside Mr. Najafi's groups, I mean, there's been many other Sunni Arab communities up in the north that are very frustrated that they're not getting, who want to fight Daesh, okay, and that are not necessarily supportive of Najafi. We've told them, if you want to get support, then you have to be trained by, go to the Kurds. Either go to Baghdad or go to the KRG. And I don't necessarily agree with, in that part in the north because they're both fighting over territories. But there still is an issue among who is going to be on whose side up in the northern area that's part of this problem.
I'd like to add just one sentence. Anybody tells you, I represent the Shia of Iraq or the Sunni of Iraq or the Kurds of Iraq, run.
Right.
You're being bamboozled.
Just
That's two sentences.
Just to transition off of this, we do understand that it's necessary to build a Sunni hold force when these areas are cleared, a force that's actually accepted by ISIS-controlled areas to ensure that it doesn't come back. But Dr. Abbas, I know you want to comment on this.
Thank you, Mike, and thanks to the panel. Excellent panel, really, and a lot of information that sheds a lot of light on issues that are not well discussed in this place, this town, I mean. But I would like to take us back to the other side of the title, which is the Unfocused Baghdad. We did talk a lot about the Unfocused White House, or Disinterested. I think it's also unfocused. But in Baghdad also, there is this part of the confusion. We always talk about the Sunnis and the grievances of the Sunnis and this enfranchisement of the Sunnis, and that's true. But also, this implies, when we just put a full stop after that, that the Shia are, as a community, as a population, are the ones who are getting the privileges and the niceties, etc. I know that the panel did not say that or even imply it, but that's, when we don't shed the light on the other side, untrained eyes would probably think that because that's the logical thing. Otherwise, why don't talk about it? I believe that the Shia community also have similar, if not more, disenfranchisement and hurt and lack of governance, and on top of that, they get the blame for what happens to the Sunnis. Let's remember that the Shia live the same conditions that are not good for human habitat. They don't have services, they don't have good governance, and on top of that, they have as I said, the blame. So here, not to mention, of course, also their sons are being fighting, and heavy casualties are given by the Hashd al-Shabi, etc., from the south. So I think we need to talk about as well about this side, because our problem is not a community versus another. Our problem is that government in Baghdad, there is a lopsided privilege for the Shia politicians who are corrupt, who are doing everything to hinder the process. And what Ambassador al-Istrabadi just mentioned, it's exactly right. The lack or the prevention, I stress what he says, the prevention of the development and establishment of a good constitutional framework, and that you got really the Shia politicians and parties the privilege, and then the Shia as a community get the rap for it as if they are part of it. Let's remember, and I will close with that the ones who recently sacked the parliament and sacked the building of the Council of Ministers were the Shia protesters, and they have been sitting in the streets for months every Friday in mass demonstrations, and until now, when the parliament is enjoying a vacation, they are in the heat of Baghdad and other cities. I think they also need their plight needs to be highlighted, and our policy in Washington needs to focus on this idea that these politicians in Baghdad of all sides have to be held accountable, and then so we can get all Iraqi communities a fair chance. And Denise also can say a lot about what happens in Kurdistan with the politicians there. Thank you very much for the panel, and sorry if I took long.
Ambassador would like that.
I want to say, Dr. Abbas Khalil and I often are sparring partners on television, but I agree 100% with every word that you've said. As a matter of fact, one of my theses is that the Shia rank and file, ordinary Shia of Iraq, have been amongst the biggest losers of the post-2003 dispensation. In a democratic Iraq, because of demographics, of course the Shia of Iraq will have a huge voice in the direction of the country. They have been the first victims of the failure of the political class, in my opinion. If you're in the southern three governorates of Iraq, Basra, Diqar, and Maysan, you're sitting on 90% of Iraq's oil wealth. You're in your 14th year without electricity and basic services. I mean, there is a disconnect between the political elites in Baghdad and the rank and file in the country, which is something worthy of a science fiction. There's a science fiction novel, unfortunately I don't remember the name of it, where there's an elite that rules the planet, that lives in the clouds, and the ordinary people live on the surface of the planet. This is a metaphor for Iraq. So yes, I absolutely agree with you.
I will actually ask the State Department to edit that out, where you actually agree with each other, just because I like the back and forth. One thing we want to be able to say here is we respect the Shia volunteer from Basra that is defending his country, and we can be both against Al-Qaeda, ISIS, also against Asab al-Haq, against Kitab Hezbollah, against IRGC proxies, and not conflate the Shia nationalists with a Shia militia leader or a Sunni nationalist with a Sunni insurgent group. That's very important because I think that's often left out. I'll come to you. I'm going to go to this gentleman here, and I'll come back to you.
Oh, there's no. We're doomed.
Thank you, Michael, for this great panel. So I have two very quick questions. The first one is probably for Dr. Natali. Do you really take the Kurds seriously who say they're going to declare independence? They're going for the independence referendum because Iraq has ceased to exist as a unified entity on the ground. That's first. And the second one, for Mr. Ambassador probably, it seems to me the Sunni Arabs who once constituted probably the most nationalistic part of Iraq no longer feel so because of the sectarian policies pursued by the Baghdad government. And one evidence to support this claim is the fact that they have accepted to live under a pre-modern Sunni Arab caliphate, self-described caliphate, for 2 years. They haven't shown any sign of uprisings against this brutal regime in Mosul, in Anbar. If they felt Iraqis, shouldn't they kick out these group who are also Sunnis? Thank you.
Thanks, Namo. By the way, Namo was my first student when I was teaching in the Kurdistan region, so we go back a long way, and now it's his chance to stick it to me, too. Namo, you've already had a referendum, right, on independence in 2003, so we all know what the answer is going to be. In my last trip in late March, one of the Kurdish officials said to me, you can probably figure out which region. So what? This is like a lottery. Of course we know what the answer is going to be. The issue is, can it be implemented? And in that sense, right now, the answer is absolutely no. Okay. Why I think this is being done is because of some of the reactions to what Ambassador Istrabadi said. You have a lot of political crises in the Kurdistan region. You have economic crises. And of course, the Kurds are going to take advantage. Certain leaders are certainly going to take advantage of this mess in Iraq. I just look at it differently. I don't think, even if everybody wants this, this is not about some highly autonomous, strong, economically viable region that's just going to break away. You know, you are landlocked. And the fact of the matter is, it's not about just what the Kurds want. And I think there's probably some people in Baghdad would say go. Will Turkey, will Iran, will your other neighbors keep your borders open? Will everybody else around you be amenable to this? Do you want to live in instability? You know, there's a lot of other questions than, do I take this seriously? I think it is a good discourse, if you're a leader and you're in trouble, to prove your authenticity, to displace problems internally, to say, I don't want to hear about my problems inside the parliament when I'm not supposed to be here as president anyway, so let's talk about nationalism. Let's talk about Kurdish statehood. I mean, that's the cynical side of me. But there's also a practical side of me, even if there's a referendum, the question would be, so what? I mean, what are you going to do with that? You know, there's like $30 billion in debt from oil stuff. So I'm not trying to harp on your problems. I just can't practically see this at this time.
I don't agree with the gentleman's, I'm sorry I didn't get your name, but
Namo.
Mr. Namo, I didn't get the, sorry, I don't agree with the premise of your question that the Sunnis are the most nationalist in Iraq. Let me remind you that the Shia of Iraq, who constitute at least, if not more than 60% of the population, constituted that proportion of the Iraq army in the 1980-1988 war with Iran. If they were not loyal to the Iraqi state and had they not fought for Iraq against Iran, the Iraqi state would have been broken in 1980. So let's not let the pros get ahead of us. It's very easy to sit in Washington, D.C. and say, why didn't this group rebel? Why don't they overthrow Daesh? Well, you could say that about all Iraqis for 35 years of Ba'athist rule. We did not succeed as Iraqis in overthrowing Saddam. Yes, and yes, but we failed. So apparently we didn't try hard enough. If I were to use your logic, I would say it's because we didn't oppose Saddam enough. There is something to a raw brutality, to a state in the case of Saddam, a non-state actor in the case of ISIL, prepared to, I mean, there's a reason ISIL has its members, in some instances, executing their own mothers. That focuses the attention of the others wonderfully, to paraphrase, the minds of others wonderfully, to paraphrase Dr. Johnson. As for the Sunnah of Iraq, how many internally displaced people have fled ISIL-controlled territories? Why isn't that the Sunnah of Iraq voting with their feet, those who can, against ISIL? So this notion that the Sunnah accept ISIL or favor ISIL is one of the canards we need to dispose of. The question isn't that. The question has always been, have we given them a sufficient sense of enfranchisement? And yes, Dr. Kadhim is right, Dr. Abbas Kadhim is right, not just the Sunnah, every Iraqi. Have we given every Iraqi a sufficient enfranchisement, a sufficient sense of enfranchisement in the country? The answer to that is simply no. And until we do, we will not succeed against ISIL or any other group, and we'll go from, as Professor Natali said, we'll go from ISIL to ISIL 2.0 and 3.0 and 4.0, and when we're all very old, and we're all in the first flowering of our youth on this panel now, when we're all very old, we'll be reconvening to wonder how we're dealing with the current incarnation of ISIL. This is a fundamental issue that must be dealt with. On the Kurds, if I can, I'd like to comment on that. The Kurds have a strategic decision to make. Are they in or are they out? If they are out, fine. Let them deal with Turkey and Iran. They can't both be out. I can't have responsible leaders in the KRG. I absolutely believe in the right of the Kurds to secession. But they can't both be telling me that they're entitled, that they want self-determination and independence, and oh, by the way, we'd like our percentage of the IMF loans. Which one is it? Take me back. Now, I happen to be from Baghdad, but let me place myself as a resident again of Basra, Misan and Dhiqar. What's the argument for me to fund through the 17% the Kurds still demand? And it's their right, legally they're right. What's the argument to convince me, when I have no basic services, that the Kurds should get 17% to fund against the happy day when they can declare their independence? You want your independence? Take it. No one ever has independence given. It's taken. Take it, and then preserve it as best you can.
This is the real issue of this panel is there's ISIS in Iraq, yet these are the things that are being talked about while an enemy still populates these Sunni population centers. Everybody's looking to exploit their power bases and position, and that's why ISIS is able to do these things, conduct these attacks. I'll let both of you comment, then I'm going to go to you, then to you, sir, and then to you. So please.
If I could say,
Dr.
you know,
Natali.
oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
You know, Michael remembers this, some of you remember. I mean, one of the first things that ISIS did when it came in, of course, it came in acting as a protector in some ways, you know, against a sectarian government, but which some of the primarily Sunni population said, well, as long as ISIS is fighting this government and these militias, we're okay to let them sit back and fight them. But then ISIS began to target people of influence, you know, former Sahwa leaders or tribal leaders, you know, they began to eliminate them because they didn't want to see a repeat of what happened in 2007 with, you know, the tribal awakening, those things. So the population doesn't like living under an ISIS banner. But right now, they, as you say, you know, there's just not much of an option for them right now.
You can't pick up the phone and call the police or call the military because there
I
isn't.
can say one thing about Dr. Abbas Khatam. You know, our reconciliation program that was established, you know, was a reflection of Iraqi society. I mean, we tried to get that bridge, and I had a few calls at midnight to come and meet some leaders from the South, Shia leaders, and they asked me a question that put me in a difficult position. That was, Colonel Welch, what would the U.S. do if a coup was led against this government? You know, now these were Shia from the South, and they were talking about seizing oil fields and things because they thought the corrupt, you know, it was all going to the political elite. So there was a lot of suffering in the South under the government, and continues to be. So we recognize that.
I just want to make a final point, when even to Namal's question again, and to emphasize, to go beyond this 3 or even 5-part Iraq, Sunni, Shia, Kurd. Post-ISIL Iraq is really a different place, not only in the deep communal distrust between Yazidis and Kurds, Kurds and Arabs, Syrian and this one, but it's become so hyper-localized and so hyper-fragmented, which actually could be a good thing, because these little entities can't sustain themselves. They actually have to be part of some kind of an Iraqi state, because they're not strong regions. But to look at Iraq as local at this time, that people are taking care of their localities and not thinking simply, what do the Sunni need to get? I mean, that's part of it. There's part of it, but it's also where your region is. And Namal, back to that, I have to just add, I don't like to say the Kurds either, because you know very well, there's very smart, pragmatic people inside the region now saying that this is ridiculous, right? That we're not even entertaining the idea of this independence. It's being politicized. We need to work with Baghdad. We have to be part of Iraq, because our other alternative is being a vassal state of Turkey. And this was told to me over and over again, you know, the golden handcuff policy that you have now. So, there are pragmatic people inside these regions, in localities, asking for greater decentralization, right? And it's not just because we're the Kurds or the Sunni Arabs. And I think it would be helpful, even for U.S. policies, to move away from that, because it's not reflective of reality.
Yes.
My name is Olivia De La Pena. I am a student journalist from George Mason University. And one thing I'm curious about, this is for the Colonel, is that you were saying that a major issue we have is that with the embassy rotations, there's not that strong relationship building. Now I want to take a look more from a U.S. perspective. So we're about to go through a big administrative change. And hypothetically, if you have Trump, who there's no guarantees that he will become the president, but there's a pretty high chance he could. And after all those comments he said about Muslims and how he wants to ban them from the U.S., how is that going to change the relationship building we've already established right now under this current administration?
Well, I mean, if he really believes that and he would implement that, it will fail. I mean, it's about relationships of trust. You can't paint one group with a broad brush, because of some bad actors inside the group, and so it will simply fail if he cannot build relationships, in that particular group. Then his policy will fail. But I think there are enough folks with enough experience in the region, hopefully, that would get any president to understand the dynamic that is necessary to have some success. So
He'll hear from enough veterans that it was Sunni Muslims that kept us alive, Shia Muslims that kept us alive in Iraq, and we wouldn't have been able to decimate al-Qaeda without them. So he is hearing enough of that, and he will continue to hear that if he gets to that location. So I need to go to this gentleman here, and then I'll go to you, sir.
Thank you to the panel. You've all done a great job of demonstrating, arguing for the preference of a unified Iraq. So thank you for that. And I'd like to ask a question that actually piggybacks on what Ms. DePena just said. Let's consider the time span involved of creating a democracy, and let's consider democratization in the larger context of other countries that have gone through this painful process. For example, Taiwan started as a dictatorship, I think, in 1948, and it stayed a dictatorship for at least 40 years. And then in the early 1990s, the Taiwanese people themselves decided they wanted democracy, and so they were allowed to create a party in opposition to the Kuomintang, and then they eventually, in 1996, for the first time, they elected someone in opposition. Another example is Korea. South Korea was a dictatorship from 1953, and it stayed a dictatorship, some people say until the mid-1990s, until the Korean people themselves had gotten wealthier and they got more sophisticated, and they wanted a two-party or three-party or five-party system. So the point is, it takes a long time, and Iraq has had no foundation whatsoever in 5,000 years of a democratic system that would look like Northern Virginia. So the question I have is about the disinterested White House. To what extent have the American presidents and the political class failed to make the case that there should be a long-term engagement in Iraq that's similar to the long-term engagement that we had in Germany after the Nazis, in South Korea after 1953, and in Taiwan? So to what can be done? What should the White House, what should the aspiring candidates do? What could they do to educate the American people about the needs of the national security interests of the United States in Iraq?
Thank you. Ambassador, you want to tackle that? Who wants to tackle that?
Well, first of all, the notion that Iraq knows nothing about democracy for 5,000 years, the very first bicameral legislature in recorded history was in southern Iraq, in ancient Sumer, and it passed a resolution. This is in a book by Samuel Noah Kramer called History Begins at Sumer. It passed a king decided to go to war without getting the bicameral legislature's approval. That bicameral legislature convened and passed a resolution that said the king did not have the authority to go to war without its approval. It then gave its approval. And I would say I forgot to pin it on my jacket when I left Bloomington, Indiana yesterday. I ordinarily wear the flag pin of the Iraqi monarchy. We did have nascent democratic institutions, although of course not full democracy for a period of the monarchy. I can't mention his name, I suppose, but there's a retired general, American general, who's a very close friend of mine. He always says that he didn't have an exit strategy with his kids. He had a long-term engagement strategy. And he obviously uses that as an analogy of what we should have been doing in Iraq all along. There has not been for a very long time, including, I think, since at least halfway through the W. Bush administration, a long-term engagement strategy. And there isn't one now. There certainly isn't one in this administration. I think this administration is looking at January 20th as its exit strategy, which is unfortunate, but perhaps inevitable in the American system. So I think what I would like to see, instead of arguing about whether or not the Iraq war was or wasn't a good idea, since none of us can turn the clock back to 2003, I take the premise of your question, and that is, what are the U.S. interests in Iraq? Does the U.S. have an interest in Iraq? Would American interests in the region and in the world be affected by the breakdown of Iraq? I think the answer to those questions is yes. I think the breakup of Iraq would constitute a threat to U.S. interests in the region, and certainly those of its allies. And if that's true, then what are the U.S. interests? And I think we've been trying to outline some of those. There may be others, and you're not going to get, Iraq's not going to look like Minnesota next year. It's going to take time. If we can get to a point of power sharing, well, the delivery of basic services, genuine power sharing, and setting a precedent for the peaceful transfer of authority. That is, there may be other things, but that is as close to success in the short to intermediate term as I think you can hope for, other than, in the words of the poet, dying in your sleep.
We also, I don't see in the next, again, I don't know who's going to win or not the presidency, but we're coming from post-Afghanistan, post-Iraq intervention, and the epic of state building, nation building, democracy promotion. I think we've moved away from that, and I wouldn't expect that kind of engagement that we had in the 90s or even post-2003 to occur. But we do have the Strategic Framework Agreement, which is the basis of how we are working with the Iraqi government, which includes security arrangements, political, cultural, and economic. And that's not under the rubric of democracy promotion, but it certainly is forming the basis in which we will continue, in my view, our relationship to engage with the Iraqi government, with Iraq. That includes all different of its components. And that's at minimum. I don't see that framework agreement being removed anytime in the near future.
Thank you.
I would just add, we used to say in the very beginning that it looked like America wanted the Iraqis to do something faster and better than we did it ourselves. And many of our leaders were calling for a longer term engagement and patience, basically, while to help the Iraqis. But I was in a lot of meetings in the first year or two where many Iraqis were telling our leaders, Iraq is not ready for elections. It's not ready for any of this just yet. Give it time to settle down, get it time to clean out the institutions and begin to build the foundation of institutions. But another phrase we used, we thought the committee to reelect our President Bush took over running the war, and that they wanted the appearance of success, not building the foundations for success. And that was sort of early that seemed to get us off track. So the expectation that it's going to take a long time needs to be sold here to the American people, and we need to create that expectation and create some patience on the Iraqi side. But it still takes this full court, this press, to get the politics of it right and to try to help keep it on track.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much, Alexander Kravitz. Great panel, but I couldn't help feel pessimistic about, sort of what you're telling us. And I was wondering, hoping not, but wondering if we're not going to find ourselves, in June 2020, kind of having a similar conversation, just before the next administration at that time. I have a couple of questions. One is, I'm wondering if you could comment on corruption, specific issues of corruption. I mean, in terms of pursuit of corruption and, corruption, rule of law. There was a case of the 52, I believe, officers that were arrested immediately after the fall of Mosul. I'm curious if you just know what happened to them, if anything happened to them. and other cases of corruption, financial and whatnot. In listening to you, one can almost, it almost feels like it's a comedy of errors in terms of the policy making. And to the Colonel's comments, that's very easy to see why, in Iraq they would see it as the conspiracy theory, right? But I'm wondering if any of you would care to comment on who gets it here in the U.S., in terms of the policy making, in terms of what would be right, without meaning to put you on the spot, but putting you on the spot. And finally, I'm curious if the ambassador would care to expand on his comments about U.S. diplomacy and the expiration of the presidential term in the Kurdistan that you mentioned earlier.
Well, I think at first, just because we only have 9 minutes left, if you would talk about who gets it in the United States, who you think gets it. And I can tell you that the 52 officers that were supposedly punished from Mosul, the majority of them were laterally promoted and are now leading other military units in and around, with some exceptions.
I'll make it. I don't want to get into the corruption because we can go on forever. Really, all parts of it. Who gets it? There's a lot of people who get it. The problem is, we have these discussions on why we're not focusing on political. How does it get moved up to this level? This level, there's a lot of people who get it. There's another bigger problem, in my view. It's the interagency, and we went through this in 2003 and before. It's the interagency. My views, not those of the government, feuding, right? Who's got control of what? Who's making these final decisions? Whether that's between Congress, DOD, State Department, White House. These are some of the issues that I think are, let's say, frustrating coordination at certain levels where you could be more efficient. I'll try to about it. And that's still there, and that persists big time in this current operation.
Maybe this is a low-level view of this corruption issue, but in our 2008 agreement, if I remember right, it says, America pledged to Iraq we would protect it from external enemies and internal threats. And corruption, of course, is the internal threat. And I used to say at our weekly targeting meetings, there's a target missing, and that is, we knew leaders that were really not acting in Iraq's best interest. Now, that goes against, allowing them to be a sovereign nation, but they were as much a threat to the democratization process in Iraq as any external threat, and we did relatively nothing to protect Iraqi people against that threat.
Go ahead.
I actually do want to make a comment about the corruption. That is, you can focus on the individuals, and they're there, but it's also about institutions. If you don't have a proper penal system, if you don't have transparent banking institutions, well, of course, this is all going to go on. So, there's just a whole vacuum of when the Iraqi state breaking down, and this corruption occurred during Saddam's periods. You could penalize people more, but there's a total collapse of some of these institutions in which banking, finance can be traced, money, oil, the whole bit. So it's a big, open smuggling operation right now, because who can be penalized and be, if these 52 officers were given promotions, think of all of the other folks involved in this. It's just one big bakshish,
Yeah. The rule of law, corruption.
It is.
The fact that officers were arrested, 52 or however many, you could say is a sign of the corruption. Not they were being promoted, although that would also be
Laterally promoted.
that also would be one thing. But the very fact, because the fact of the matter is, the fault for Mosul started at the very top. The commander-in-chief in the Iraqi constitutional system is the prime minister. Very senior American officials, and again off the record, under Chatham House rules, said to me in these words, Maliki's coup-proofing the army. He was intentionally weakening the army, which collapsed in Mosul subsequently. So there's that, by the way, is in a sense is corruption in the city, in this city. That is to say, tolerating while just exactly the point that Professor Natali was making, while giving support to the government of Iraq, being aware of things that the Iraqi government was doing to or individuals in the Iraqi government, in this case the prime minister, were doing to undermine the very policy that the United States was promoting. There's corruption all the way around, and it isn't just financial corruption, although in Iraq, the late Ahmed Chalabi claimed, I think, that something like $350 billion, which is a large enough sum in this city, it's a huge sum in Iraq, the $350 billion were unaccounted for, I think, over a 6-year period or something like that. And if he was even substantially right, this is just an incredible theft. I mean, here we are in our 14th year. We've not built a school. We've not paved, worthy of the name, we've not paved a road. We've not built a hospital. I mean, the entire system is corrupt. And this is, again, Dr. Kadhim talked about the protesters in Baghdad. There is real frustration in the capital. And incidentally, I'm not an historian, Dr. Kadhim is, but I think I'm right. You know, the official number, and let's assume it's accurate, is that four demonstrators were shot dead when they took over the Green Zone the last time. 1948, Iraq negotiated the Portsmouth Agreement. Hugely unpopular. There were mass demonstrations in the streets against it. In fact, the government did fall, not through a vote of confidence, but just because of chaos in the city. The army was called out to restore order, 1948. They shot and killed unarmed demonstrators. That was the moment when, as I understand it, the Iraqi Communist Party took the view not merely that the political system needed to change politically, but that the monarchy itself had to be toppled. Now, that didn't take place for another 10 years, and the monarchy wasn't toppled until 1958. Memories of all of this, by the way, are fresh in Iraqis' mind. 1948 may sound like prehistory here, but the events of 1948 were memorialized by the great Arab poet, Jawahiri, in stanzas that are still memorized by school students. The consequences, and there wasn't a peep out of Washington, the consequences for that act, and if it's repeated, could be awesome to behold. Because I don't believe there's another capital, there's not another peoples in the world that would tolerate the lack of services that the Iraqis have. We're in our 14th year. Saddam Hussein restored electricity in 1991, at least in the capital, in 6 months. My point on the Kurdistan region was not to take a position on whether or not, on how the issue of the presidency in Kurdistan should be resolved. That's the Kurdistan region is a federated region in Iraq, of which I am not a resident. I'm from Baghdad. I have no opinion on how the issue should be resolved. My point was to elucidate the destructive interference. In quantum mechanics, you have constructive and destructive interference. This is destructive interference by the United States. When the Iraqi political class is attempting, however inartfully, however much inconveniently temporarily for U.S. policy, when it is attempting to fashion its own constitutional and political and legal institutions and political institutions, the United States must allow that to occur. Policymakers come and go. That's one of the other points you made. We have to live with the consequences this is to say the Iraqis, we have to live with the consequences of what the U.S. does leave behind for generations. I'm sorry I'm going on for a long time, but let me give one more example.
You have the last word.
Thank you. Let me give you one more example. I was once at a conference in which one of the interveners said that, speaking of the colonial period, the Arab colonial period, in the post-World War I period, that the Arabs didn't learn the lesson of democracy that the colonial powers wanted to impart to them. I intervened to say that, in fact, the Arabs learned, peoples of the Middle East learned precisely the lesson that was taught to them by the colonial powers. In Egypt and in Syria, for instance, whenever the elected governments in those countries did something that the High Commissioner didn't like, be he the British or French High Commissioner, the constitution was suspended. And so Egypt and Syria has a long history of suspended constitutions. In Jordan, during the mandatory period, the British ruled without a constitution for the entire period of the mandate. They created a constitution just in time to hand it over to the new king, King Hussein, who immediately suspended the constitution and ruled for the next 25, 30 years without a constitution. In Iraq, the constitution was simply ignored in the mandatory period. It was never officially suspended. It was simply ignored. And we have a history in Iraq of never suspending the constitution. We may change it after a coup d'etat, but the constitution never gets suspended. It's simply ignored. So the precedents we're setting now as the, I don't want to say the new colonial power, but as the power that in theory was teaching us the lessons of democratization, will last in Iraq long after the average American will remember that America was involved in Iraq at all. And that should focus our minds wonderfully in this city and in Baghdad and in Erbil.
Well, with that, we've taken it to our limit. I'd like to thank all of you for coming, and more importantly, thank our panelists. Thank you for being here. I thought it was a great panel.